Folks call me David, short for David McAllister. I have been married to my wife, Sarah, for 4 years now. We have not had any kids yet, mostly because we both enjoy our freedom too much. Maybe we will think about it in the future, but not until we are well into our 30s. Sarah and I grew up in modest homes just a few streets apart, but we did not meet until we were 20 at a local job fair. Sarah excelled at college, eventually becoming an accountant and later a financial manager, while I always struggled with school and never graduated. But I had grit, and I knew how to hustle. I started working when I was 16 as a cleaner in local shops and offices. By the time I was 19, I was managing a team of 25 employees and had contracts with some of the largest companies in our town. The first time I met Sarah, she approached my booth at the job fair. She handed me her resume and, with a playful smile, said, "I am not looking for a cleaning job, but maybe you want my number." I could not resist. I called her before she even left the fair, and the next night we went out to dinner. For years later, we were married, and we still laugh about how that one moment changed everything. Sarah landed a job in the purchasing department at Winfield Industries, starting from the bottom. After 8 years, she worked her way up to managing both the purchasing and financial control departments. With both of us working, we lived pretty comfortably. Meanwhile, my cleaning business took off after I bought out 2 competitors, and now we were doing better than ever. One day, about 4 months ago, something strange happened. I was at my desk when my secretary told me that a man was waiting to see me. She handed me his card, Brian Thompson, private investigator. It took me by surprise, but I told her to bring him in. I greeted Brian, shook his hand, and asked what brought him to my office. After some brief small talk, he got straight to the point. "You can call me Brian," he said as he sat down. "I'm a private investigator, and I'm working for a client who thinks his wife may be having an affair, or at least is close to it. His wife works as an accountant at Sheldon Engineering, and she has been receiving a lot of attention from one of their new salesmen, Richard Evans. He's been sending her flowers, late-night messages, and has even tried to arrange a weekend trip. We have gathered a lot of information, but we still need a bit more to complete the case." It felt like something out of a detective movie, and at first, I found it kind of funny. But when Brian mentioned Atlantic Metals, a supplier for Sheldon, it caught my attention because Sarah's firm also worked with them. And this Richard Evans? He sounded like someone I would want to keep Sarah away from. Brian was waiting for me to respond. "I get the gist, but how can I help you with all this?" I asked. He smiled. "It's simple. This Richard Evans has been leaving flowers and notes on her desk. She reads them, then usually throws them away. Your cleaning staff handles the trash, right? We are hoping they can collect anything personal from him and pass it on to us. We have already cleared this with her company, and there are no legal issues on that front. If you want to confirm, here's the CEO's card." I looked down at the business card Brian handed me, trying to process what was happening. I dialed the number, and he answered on the second ring without any formalities. "David, I understand Brian Thompson is with you. I authorize you to receive and pass along any non-company related information to him or his team. Our lawyer is drafting a formal letter, and we'll email it to you shortly. I've got to run. He's waiting in my office, but call me if you need anything else." With that, he hung up before I could even respond. Clearly, they wanted this sorted out quickly. Brian gave me a knowing smile, and I just nodded. He confirmed everything. "So, go ahead and give me all the details. We'll start collecting her trash in a separate bag, and he'll sort through it here. You can pick it up each morning at 11. Will that work for you?" Brian nodded, satisfied. "Perfect." I called the crew leader responsible for Emma's office, and Brian directed us on exactly what to look for: early lunches, late lunches, flowers, notes, and so on. We worked with Brian for about 6 weeks, and at the end of it, he declared the investigation over. One of my employees had noticed that the person we were monitoring hadn't returned after lunch. Brian followed them to a motel, and that incident led to the couple's divorce. Work and life returned to normal, until one day when I noticed that Sarah seemed a bit off. I tried to ask her about it, but she kept things to herself. About a week later, Linda, a longtime employee who had been with me almost from the start, came into my office. Linda was more than just a valued worker. She was like a mentor, being 25 years older than me. She treated me like her own son. As she settled into a chair, I could tell something was wrong. She began. Remember a few months back when we were involved in that surveillance at the office? My interest peaked. How could I forget? That was a pretty wild time. Why are you bringing it up now? Well, she hesitated. As you know, I now work in the same office as your wife. The man we were monitoring, Richard Evans, is now visiting her office. I noticed a large bouquet of flowers on her desk, and she took them with her to lunch. Here's the card that came with the flowers. She handed me the card, and I read it. Dear Sarah, thank you for helping me renew my contract with your company. I can't express how grateful I am. I hope you'll join me for lunch so we can catch up. With love, Richard. My blood ran cold. The language on the card felt too personal, more than just business. I remembered from Brian that this guy had a reputation for pursuing married women, and now, my wife was in his crosshairs. I thanked Linda and asked her to keep an eye on things and let me know if any other notes showed up. Without wasting any time, I picked up the phone and dialed Brian's number. He answered on the third ring. Hello, David. How can I assist you? I jumped right in. One of my staff just gave me a heads up. She used to handle the nightly cleanup during your investigation. Now, she's in my wife's office and says the same Richard Evans is making moves on Sarah. He's even taking her out to lunch, and I've got a card here with flowers from him that makes his intentions clear. Brian took a deep breath. We're continuing to investigate Mr. Evans. You're actually the third husband dealing with him. The difference is, the other two weren't aware of who he was at first. They've agreed to share the expenses. Would you like to join them? I didn't hesitate. Absolutely. What's the next step? Brian suggested a meeting with the other husbands at 2 p.m. Swing by my office to fill out the paperwork and exchange information. I arrived at Brian's office at precisely 1:55 p.m. There, I met Sam Williams and Tom Fisher, along with Brian and his associate, Steve Jones, who was gathering data for the case. Brian opened the meeting. Gentlemen, you're all here because you share a similar predicament. Sam, Tom, this is David, and he's interested in joining your investigation. If you're okay with it, we'll register him as a client and proceed. They looked at me, then nodded in agreement. That sounds good. The paperwork only took about 15 minutes, and I used my personal credit card to pay the $5,000 fee, so Sarah wouldn't notice it on our joint account. Brian then addressed us all. Our common problem here is Richard Evans. David, just to fill you in, Sam's wife works alongside Mr. Evans at Atlantic Metals, while Tom's wife is employed by the local school board, which gets materials from Atlantic Metals for their tech classes. Evans has a habit of pursuing women at their workplaces, married women, specifically. He sends them flowers, messages, takes them out to lunch, and then tries to lure them to a motel afterward. He enjoys knowing that the husbands are aware he's winning their wives' affections. He's even convinced some childless women to ask their husbands for hall passes. Over the past year, we've documented 5 divorces in our area that can be attributed to him. Further investigation revealed that he used to work in Phoenix but was fired after 7 husbands sued him in a class action lawsuit for alienation of affection. Brian Thompson sipped his coffee slowly, letting the weight of his words settle between us before continuing. David, does your team handle any cleaning contracts at Sarah's offices? Maybe the school district building, or one of the places her company works with. If you happen to collect trash from her office, you could use that to your advantage, unless there's a confidentiality agreement in place with any of the companies involved. I shook my head, feeling the tension coil tighter in my chest. No, we don't work at either of those places. That's too bad, Brian acknowledged, taking a long breath. But that doesn't mean we're out of options. You can still keep an eye on her, gather what you can from her movements and behavior. Then, he asked me, who pays the bill for Sarah's phone? My business does, I responded, my voice barely steady. Brian grinned, the hint of a plan forming behind his eyes. All right, that's good news. What kind of phone does she use? It's a Samsung. Perfect, he replied. Reaching into his briefcase and pulling out a form, he slid it across the table. Fill this out. Once that's done, scan this QR code from her phone. It'll connect directly to our server, and after you input the provided username and password, we'll be able to track all her calls, messages, emails, and chats. This guy, Richard Evans, typically sticks to using mobile phones. That way, He avoids slip-ups on shared lines. The tension in the room hung like a storm cloud as I nodded, the reality of what I was about to do sinking in. The meeting ended shortly after, and I exchanged phone numbers with Sam Williams and Tom Fisher, the two other men in similar situations. Brian and Steve Johnson, his associate, were added to our WhatsApp group so we could stay updated on developments as things unfolded. I stayed up, pacing in the living room, trying to figure out how to play this. I knew if I made the wrong move, it would all blow up in my face. I had to be strategic. I had to be patient. Around midnight, when Sarah got up to use the bathroom, I finally saw my chance. I quickly grabbed her phone, scanned the QR code, input the necessary details, and returned it to its spot without waking her. My heart pounded, but I had done it. Now, it was just a waiting game. The next morning, Sarah wandered around the house like a ghost. She seemed distracted, almost as if her mind was somewhere far away. I tried to make small talk, but she barely engaged with me. It was like I wasn't even there. At 11:30 a.m., Brian called. His tone was calm, but I could tell something serious was coming. "David, we've gone through the initial data dump from her phone. She set up a new email account specifically for him. We weren't sure how they were communicating, but this clears it up. He's been working on her for a while, using the same tactics he's used on other women. He's convinced her that since you were her first, she's missing out on some kind of experience. He's pushing her to explore things outside of your marriage, saying it'll somehow make your relationship stronger. Has she agreed to meet him again?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Brian sighed before answering. "Yeah, he sent her a message this morning. He wants to meet her tomorrow at a cafe and make some plans. He's told her that if she talks to you about it, it won't count as cheating." Her reply was just one word, "Okay." Hearing that single word hit me like a punch to the gut. I knew she was slipping away, and this guy was making it easier for her to justify what she was doing. I hung up the phone after the call with Brian and sank into the couch, staring at nothing. Confronting her directly wouldn't solve anything. Evans had already gotten inside her head. This wasn't going to stop unless I ended it myself. I called Brian back a little later, my voice steady but cold. "Brian, I think this is it. He's making his move, and I'm not sure I can stop it without filing for divorce. But I need to have a backup plan in place." There was a long pause on the other end before Brian replied. "It's smart to have a backup plan, but if you don't act soon, Evans won't stop. I've seen men like him before. His ego is too big to let go easily. If forgiveness isn't an option for you, then divorce might be the only way to shut this down for good." "All right," I replied, the decision settling in my mind. "Let's move ahead with preparing for that. I'll talk to my lawyer." The next morning, I met with my attorney. He poured me a cup of coffee, looking me over like he knew something big was coming. "So, what's got you worked up this time, David?" I smirked despite myself. "It's Sarah. There's a guy at her work who's been pushing her into an affair, and I think she's about to go through with it." He nodded, understanding, and we spent the next hour mapping out my options. Since we didn't have kids, things were relatively simple. We'd sell the house, split the business assets, and move on. Going after Evans or his company directly would be a waste of time and money. By the time I left his office, everything was in place. That entire week, Sarah's behavior was erratic. One day, she'd act like nothing was wrong, laughing and talking to me like old times. The next, she'd barely look me in the eye. The tension was unbearable. Then, on Friday afternoon, Linda, the employee I trusted the most, called me. "Richard, Sarah just received a massive bouquet of flowers today. Thought you'd want to know." I didn't need any more confirmation. That was it. I had reached my breaking point. I noticed Brian Thompson's post in the group chat, inviting Sam Williams to dinner at Sam's Steakhouse. We all knew Brian's intentions by now, yet the situation with Sam remained unresolved. Desperately, I urged Sam to go, hoping he'd finally sort out his own mess. Maybe seeing him confront his situation would give me the push I needed to handle mine. The weight of everything was making me clumsy. I dropped my phone twice that morning, and it wasn't even 9 a.m. yet. As I sent a message to the group, updating Brian about the flowers and the card I had found, his response came almost immediately. "I'll check her email now," he wrote. I waited, feeling a growing dread twist inside me. 5 minutes later, My phone rang. Brian didn't bother with pleasantries. "Check your WhatsApp," he said, his voice tense. I opened the app and found the document he sent me, a hotel confirmation. It was for a reservation at a Meadow Lake resort, about 30 miles away. The booking was for a double room, for the upcoming Friday and Saturday, under two names, Evans and Sarah. My throat tightened as I relayed the news back to Brian. "It's worse than that," he added after a long sigh. I dug deeper into her emails. What I found: it's practically a cheater's playbook. She's been planning this for weeks. My stomach churned as I opened the forwarded email. The email ended with a chilling line. "I leave the choice to you, Sarah. If you love him, it's not cheating." I stared at my screen, unable to process what I had just read. The betrayal was no longer a suspicion. It was a fact. She was preparing to cheat on me, and it was up to me whether I would sit by and let it happen. The weekend that followed was pure hell. I couldn't let her know what I saw. By Monday morning, I was numb. At 3 p.m., Brian called with more bad news. She sent him another email, he said, his voice low. She's offering him Thursday night. If he agrees, she'll go through with it. If not, she won't. My grip tightened on the phone. Brian continued. In his reply, Evans told her not to worry. He said it's easier to ask for forgiveness than permission. That was all I needed to hear. "Brian," I said, my voice cold and dull. Brian didn't hesitate. "I'll make sure everything is in the file, including a photo of them kissing. It's not the worst, but it's enough." I thanked him and hung up, immediately calling my lawyer to give him a heads up about the incoming folder. We arranged to meet for breakfast at a diner on Saturday to go over everything. As I hung up, I couldn't help but laugh bitterly at the thought. Nothing like reviewing a divorce petition over bacon and eggs. By Tuesday morning, I felt like I had aged a decade in a week. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Just before Sarah left for work, a courier arrived at my office, delivering the anticipated folder from Brian. I opened it and sifted through the contents. Messages from Richard, intimate photos, and anonymous accounts of other marriages he had ruined. There was a note from Sam, too, describing a particularly disturbing incident at the Mountain Crest Inn, involving Richard, his wife, and himself. His wife had run out in tears after realizing she had been used. I read the whole thing and felt nothing but a growing resolve. This had to end. I delved deeper into the folder, piecing together the overwhelming evidence of Sarah's affair. Just then, my secretary Rachel entered the room, her face etched with concern. She could sense something was wrong. Feeling completely overwhelmed, I broke down and told her everything. Surprisingly, instead of just offering sympathy, Rachel listened intently, her expression shifting from concern to something warmer. It was then that I realized I wasn't just seeing her as a secretary anymore. There was an undeniable charm about her that I had somehow never noticed before. She smiled warmly at me, and for the first time in days, I felt a little less alone. After I had calmed down, I gave Rachel instructions. Prepare the divorce papers. If Sarah goes with him this weekend, she'll get served at the hotel. No more second chances. I had been racking my brain trying to come up with a plan B to stop Sarah, but I couldn't think clearly. Rachel, now more relaxed, leaned in slightly and grinned. "You know the saying, what's good for the goose is good for the gander." She paused and then added, "Why not have your own weekend escape with your dream girl?" I chuckled, shaking my head. "And who might that be?" She raised her eyebrows playfully. "Me, of course. Your devoted secretary suggests you clear your mind. It's purely physical, nothing to do with your marriage." Her eyes sparkled with mischief as she handed me a letter she had quickly typed. "Use this letter as a guide. Send it to Sarah before she sends hers." The plan was simple yet effective. I'd force Sarah to confront her own betrayal by flipping the script on her. I liked it. That night, I went through the motions of intimacy with Sarah, but my heart wasn't in it. Tuesday night, Wednesday morning, each time was hollow. By Thursday morning, tension hung heavy in the air. I intentionally ignored her shouts about dinner as I left for work. Around noon, Brian called me with an update. "Sarah messaged Richard," he said. "She's bragging about the big dinner she's planning for you, promising to update him afterward. She's playing right into his hands." I couldn't let that happen. I went to the store and picked up everything I needed: chicken, potatoes, vegetables, and her favorite white wine. By the time Sarah returned home from her errands, I had everything ready and the house smelled of a home-cooked meal. She looked confused when she saw me in the kitchen. "What are you doing?" she asked, setting down her shopping bags. I smiled, knowing full well I had caught her off guard. "I wanted to do something special for my beautiful wife," I said cheerfully. "Let's eat. Then we'll have that talk you mentioned. It's going to be a long night." Dinner was tense. I kept things light, deflecting any conversation that might lead to her revealing her plans. Once we finished eating, I stood up and took control of the situation. "Bring your wine. Let's talk in the kitchen," I said, keeping my voice steady. She followed me, still unsuspecting. Earlier, I had placed the folder on the kitchen table, hidden under a couple of magazines. Now, as I removed the magazines, I exposed the letter that would change everything. I took a deep breath, locking eyes with her. "Sarah, you know I care about you, and I would never want to hurt you." My voice was calm, rehearsed. But we got married young, and it's become clear to me that my lack of experience has become an issue lately. My new assistant Rachel has been sharing some stories with me, and I've realized I need to clear my head before we move forward. Her face paled, but I continued. "I've arranged a hotel stay with her this weekend. It'll be purely physical, a chance for me to blow off steam and maybe learn some new things to try with you later. It doesn't affect my love for you or our marriage. I'm telling you now, so it won't be seen as a betrayal." The moment the words left my mouth, her expression shifted from confusion to fury. Her face turned bright red, and I could see the storm brewing behind her eyes. "Over my dead body!" she exploded, slamming her glass down on the counter. "That woman better be gone by Monday, or we're done." I couldn't help but laugh at the irony of it all. Her reaction was exactly what I had anticipated, and now she was feeling the same betrayal she had planned for me. I opened the folder and handed it to her, revealing the incriminating photo of her and Richard kissing on the cover. Her eyes widened, and her complexion turned ghostly pale. "You knew," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "And you played me." I smiled. "Yes, I did. Your reaction is exactly what mine would have been if the roles were reversed. Unlike you, Rachel and I never booked a hotel, shared lunches, kisses, or even conversations about love or intimacy. My story was purely fictional. Yours, however, is very real." As I spoke, Sarah began flipping through the folder, her face growing more furious with each page. The dates, times, photographs, emails, transcripts of calls, it was all laid bare for her to see. "You followed me? You invaded my privacy. How could you?" she snapped, anger flashing in her eyes. I stayed calm. "That's all there is to it, Sarah. It is time to decide what to do. I love you, but you need to understand there's a boundary, and you're dangerously close to crossing it. You have been engaging in an emotional affair with Richard and plan to make it physical. You have humiliated me and jeopardized our marriage, yet you are mad at me for trying to intervene?" Her eyes flared. "What do you mean, humiliated? I never intended to wreck our marriage. It was separate." "Listen to yourself," I interrupted, echoing her words. "You are telling me that it's not a big deal. Yet when I turned the tables, you said, 'Over my dead body.' Why is it okay for you to cheat, but not for me?" She took a deep breath, ready to argue, but I raised my hand to stop her. "There's no such thing as a free pass. If you go with Richard, it is cheating, even if you tell me about it beforehand. That won't change the fact." Sarah glanced away, clearly unsure how to respond. "I cannot deal with this right now. I need to be alone," she mumbled before standing up abruptly and running upstairs with the folder in hand. I heard the bedroom door shut and the lock click. Alone, I cleaned up the kitchen and sat down at the table. Brian had given me a tablet that displayed all of Sarah's phone activity, so I logged in and saw her exchanging messages with Richard. As I read through the messages, I was struck by how calculated she had been. She expressed worry about being followed and mentioned someone knowing about their hotel booking. Her partner had set the stage for manipulation, encouraging her to follow through no matter what and downplaying the importance of my feelings. Richard's response showed how desperate he had become, suggesting she should tell me everything was already booked and that they had to follow through. He emphasized their love and questioned my feelings for her. She was caught in the middle, torn between the thrill of the weekend and the risk of jeopardizing her marriage. I watched in disbelief as Sarah messaged him, confirming she had packed her bag for the weekend. Richard encouraged her to go ahead, reminding her that seeking forgiveness is easier than asking permission. Later that night, when I tried to enter the bedroom, I found the door unlocked. Inside, Sarah lay in bed, her packed bag clearly visible against the wall. I looked at her, the betrayal hitting me harder than before. "So, you've chosen a quick rendezvous with Richard over our marriage?" I asked, my voice cold. Without waiting for a response, I turned and left the room, heading to the guest bedroom. Her pleas followed me down the hall, but I ignored them. Lying fully clothed on the bed, I realized that this was the final straw. The emotional weight of seeing her packed bag and knowing her intentions felt like the deepest betrayal. Tears of grief streamed down my face as I spent the night consumed by thoughts of everything I had lost. The next morning, I heard Sarah moving around downstairs. I waited until she was distracted, then slipped into the master bedroom to shower. When I couldn't find my bag, I realized she had unpacked it and stowed it away. I caught the smell of coffee and bacon as I entered the kitchen. Sarah was sitting at the table, her face nervous, her hands trembling. "You think making breakfast is going to fix this?" I asked, unable to hide my bitterness. "If you go through with this weekend, it's over. We will file for divorce first thing tomorrow morning at the hotel." Her face grew pale. "Please, stay for breakfast. We need to talk," she pleaded. But I was done with words. "We have already had that conversation. Your packed bag says it all." I looked at her and said, "I won't be staying for breakfast. It's time you learn to fend for yourself if that's the choice you're making. I assume your bag is already in the car." She didn't respond but turned away, confirming my suspicions, and silently left the house. At least she seemed to understand the weight of her actions. When I reached the office, Rachel greeted me with a concerned look. "You look terrible," she remarked. I forced a grin. "And you look as stunning as ever," I responded before she could ask more questions. I have no idea how this will end. When I presented her with Plan B, she flew into a rage, saying over my dead body, and then took matters into her own hands this morning. I paused. At 11 o'clock, she'll receive a letter from me outlining the consequences. Let's see if that rattles her. Rachel brewed coffee and handed me a cup. "I hope she comes to her senses," she said, shaking her head. "Surely she cannot think this behavior is acceptable for her, but not for you." I offered a sad smile and nodded, settling into my chair. The day was a blur, unproductive. Shortly after 11 o'clock, my phone rang. It was Sarah. Her voice was shaky, the tears making her words almost incomprehensible. "Are you serious? Are you really going to divorce me?" It seemed she had convinced herself that I wouldn't actually follow through. Without hesitation, I replied, "If you betray me, it's a breach of our agreement. We both know it. You would divorce me if I cheated, right?" Her response was quiet but firm. "Yes." She coughed and then pleaded, "Will you come home to talk?" "I'll be there in 20 minutes, I replied, ending the call. I arrived first and started brewing coffee. The lingering aroma of the bacon she had cooked earlier still hung in the air. I opened the kitchen window to clear the scent. A few minutes later, Sarah walked in, carrying an envelope from the lawyer in one hand and her weekend bag slung over her shoulder. She dropped her bag at the door and stood frozen, unsure whether to approach me or not. I could see the hesitation in her eyes, torn between rushing to embrace me and knowing I might not welcome it. I poured coffee and gestured for her to join me at the table. My question was direct. "So, are you still planning to go to the hotel?" She looked hurt. "How can you even ask that after sending this?" she exclaimed, holding up the envelope. "Of course, I am not going. I love you. I want to be with you. I know you would never allow it. So it's all canceled now. Do we need to mend our marriage, or will I still be served?" She asked as she sat down across from me, her voice shaky and her chin lowered. I reached across the table and gently lifted her chin so she had to meet my eyes. "You will only be served if you show up at the hotel. No hotel, no papers." However, our marriage has been seriously strained, Sarah. So here's what needs to happen. I laid out the conditions. First, you'll call Richard in my presence. I want to hear you tell him that everything is off. Then you'll delete your personal email account, the one you used to communicate with him. Afterward, you'll inform your boss about Richard's behavior and make sure he is barred from your office. Then, we'll start counseling to figure out why you were drawn to this, why you thought it was acceptable, and how we can rebuild trust. Just as I finished, her phone rang. It was Richard. She put the call on speaker, and I heard his impatient voice. "Where are you, Sarah?" "I am waiting at the hotel reception, and I can't wait much longer." Sarah took a deep breath before replying. "Richard, I'm back home with David. He did something that really shook me. If I go through with this, my marriage will be over. I am sorry, but you're not worth it. I'm not coming." The fury in Richard's voice was immediate. "You foolish woman. Do you know how much time, effort, and money I have spent on you? And now you're backing out because your weakling husband is throwing a tantrum? You're just a coward." He spat the words angrily before hanging up. For the first time, Sarah saw him for what he truly was, a manipulative slimeball. Deleting and deactivating her email account took longer than expected, but she managed it within the hour. By the time we were done, her boss and the HR manager were at our door. Marvin Woods, the HR manager, began sternly, "Sarah, we are aware of what has happened today. To say we are displeased is an understatement, but we are offering you a chance to keep your job. Now, please tell me what happened." She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue before speaking. "About 3 months ago, our account was assigned to a new sales agent, Richard Evans. I managed the account, and Richard used to visit me almost daily. I didn't notice at first, but he started flirting, complimenting my clothes, my hair, even my smile. Then he began commenting on my figure, and I started dressing to get his attention. He sent flowers, chocolates, and eventually invited me to dinner. I foolishly accepted." She continued, "During dinner, he asked personal questions about my life, my marriage, and eventually my intimate life. He belittled my husband, telling me I deserved better. Slowly, he wore me down, bit by bit, until he proposed this weekend getaway. Fortunately, David intervened and gave me this letter telling me he would divorce me. That snapped me out of it. I told Richard the first wasn't going and that David and I were going to work on our marriage. I intended to report the incident to you, and I am thankful you are here." Marvin glanced at the CEO, who nodded slightly before addressing Sarah. "Thank you for your honesty. You made a serious error, and you are fortunate to keep your job. We have had issues with Richard's company, so we will be terminating their account. He will not be returning to the office. However, if anything like this happens again, you will be dismissed. Is that clear?" Sarah nodded. "Yes, it is." After they left, Sarah and I had lunch, and then we began searching for a marriage counselor. We found one quickly, made a call, and scheduled an appointment for the next day, which was Saturday. Later, we shared a tender moment in bed, perhaps the first real connection we had had since this whole ordeal began. As we drifted off to sleep, I realized just how close I had come to losing her. At 5 a.m., I woke and shared another intimate moment with her, a reassurance that we were on the path to healing. The counseling sessions were helpful. Sarah realized that Richard had exploited her fear of our life becoming dull, and she saw how she had provided him with the tools to manipulate her. For my part, I understood that for Richard, it had all been a game, and I came to appreciate the richness of the life Sarah and I had built together. The counseling lasted for 3 months. For years later, we are still together, and we are expecting our first child. As for Richard Evans, well, he had a nasty fall at the local shopping center, down a flight of stairs leading to the parking lot. It is still unclear how it happened, but there were at least 5 husbands in the mall that day who had reason to hold a grudge against him. We all sat together afterward, not saying a word, each of us in black jackets and baseball caps. The police never got a word out of us. What do you think about this story? Write in comments. If you don't follow our channel Cheating Room, you will probably never hear from us again. If you are subscribed, congratulations, you will not miss any exciting story. Thank you for listening to this shocking story with us. See you again.